Greetings, everyone, from Suwanee, Tennessee, here at the University of the South, the School of Theology. At my living room. But I apologize for last week. Moving here to Suwanee took a bit more time and effort, and a lot more of my availability than I thought. Also, I am still without internet here in this little cottage here, and so I'm going back and forth to still get internet service. But the university assures me that I will have it shortly. But let's dive in. What we're going to do this week is we're going to recap week 2. We're going to do week 2 this week, okay? So if you've done those readings, great. If you haven't, you can dive back in there. If you have, you can either begin looking ahead, or you can dive more deeply into the sources of theology readings that we did. You can read some more of those pages if you'd like. So to just jump right into what we're looking at here is, what is theology? I mean, like, before we even get started, that it's really important that we're looking at, when we're talking about theology, that we're really understanding it's the study of the sources, development, and relationships of a particular religion. In Christian theology, it'd be within Christianity. So what are the sources that we use? How is it developed? The thinking is developed. And what are the relationships between the different types of thoughts? In this chapter, there's some really important ideas of breaking out like the different types of theology that we look at, because they're really important. Biblical studies have a different take or different set of criteria, perhaps, than systematic theology, and same with historical theology, narrative theology, or even pastoral theology. What you find yourself probably most dealing with is pastoral theology. How do you care for, make real, and nurture the faith lives of other people? Discipleship. It's pastoral theology, looking at the lives of other people and how do you help make the faith real to them. Then there's another field that's not listed in here, is practical theology, which goes along with pastoral theology. Again, how do we break down theological constructs? How do we understand God's movement and what's going on in our world today? We'll get into more practical theology later on when we begin working toward making the shift towards our papers. How do we apply some of the theology that we've been looking at? I think that it's real important for us to just kind of pause and break and think about, what are the sources of theology that you use in your life before you even get to your ministry? In your life, what do you use to develop your understandings of God, of humanity, and of the world? Are you looking towards Scripture first and foremost? Are you looking towards tradition, what Christianity has taught through the ages? Are you looking towards reason? Or are you looking towards religious experience? We see that this is in section 6 of the book, of this unit, that's what we really begin to look at. I think it's really important. For us in our Anglican tradition, we have the three-legged stool of Scripture, tradition, and reason. And it was Wesley's quadrilateral that added to that, Wesley being an Anglican priest, John Wesley that is, being an Anglican priest, added religious experience to that. I think that we see today people turning towards that religious experience more and more. But in our Anglican tradition, we see that it's Scripture, tradition, and reason. Now, Bishop White, the first bishop of Pennsylvania, the diocese from which I'm from, and also our first presiding bishop, he said that Scripture was the foundation, beyond doubt, and that tradition and reason were two lenses to which we would read Scripture. We would read Scripture through the tradition of the church. What has the church done through the centuries? What have people believed throughout time? And that we would also read that with another lens of reason. What do we know? How does that jive with what we're reading in Scripture? How is that connecting with and interplaying with what we know and how we know it? I think those are important things. I think today in our culture and society, we see that religious experience, however, has taken a much more important role, and perhaps just experience in general, a much more important role in how individuals develop their faiths, and how we perhaps ourselves have developed our faith. When are the moments that we felt closest to God? When are the moments that we have experienced love, connection, and relationship. These are the things that help individuals to develop their understandings of the world, to answer some of the big questions about if there is a God, and what that God might be like, and what does it mean to be human, and how do we interact with the world around us, and how do we understand it. So I think that's an important thing when we're working with youth and families and young adults and everybody in between. We have to take into account their religious experience. And we have to be able to dialogue with it in effective ways and use it as a lens, perhaps, as Bishop White said, with reason and tradition, to engage into Scripture, and perhaps even to engage in those first two lenses of reason and tradition. People will not necessarily look to the other sources if it doesn't connect in some way with their experience. So how can we use religious experience as a lens in which to dive into Scripture, tradition, and reason? That might mean that we need to be creative in how we engage with youth and families and create opportunities for them to have experiences that would engage them further in dialogue with that through their own experience and lived lives. So that's important things to kind of look at as well. In Scripture, we see that there are important ways that we understand Scripture. It's not just, this is the way that it is, but there's the literal, allegorical, analogical, anthropological, or moral sense of kind of what Scripture might be saying to us. And we see it too, there's a narrative sense. What is the overarching story, the movement of this thing that we call Scripture? And Scripture really, I think, is only Scripture, the Bible itself, I believe. And let's pause. Say it with me. At some point in my life, someone will be able to call me a heretic. Your turn. At some point in my life, somebody will be able to call me a heretic. We see this all the time, that people say whether or not you're in, you're out. We measure people by their beliefs. They're not strong enough Christian. They don't believe the things that we do. And so this whole back and forth between orthodoxy and heresy is an important thing for us not to overlook. Back to the Bible. But the whole narrative of what is God doing through the Scripture, and how do I understand that Scripture, the Bible itself, only becomes Scripture, only becomes holy when I engage in it with a community and with the Spirit. And that connection is so important. You can do that individually through individual Bible study if you're using the lens of tradition, because then you have the community of the church, and all who've come before us, all who are with us now, and all who will come ahead of us in the future. You're reading it with them. And it's not just about what you are thinking, but you're reading it with them. You can do it with the lens of reason as well. That is not just about you. The problem when it comes into is you can't necessarily do that when you're using religious experience alone. And this is an important thing for us to kind of look back and help to maybe even push back against some of what we hear from the young people and their families that we work with. It just doesn't connect with my life. It just doesn't connect with my experience today. How am I supposed to connect with this when this was written with time that was so vastly different from what I do? The whole point is that we're looking at not necessarily what our experience is alone, but what is our experience as humanity? A very important thing for us to look at. Another important thing for us to think about is natural religion. And this is something that we see that today people really jump onto in many different ways. And they say, this is enough. This is enough to kind of think of that I can look around and I can use my reason, my experience, and my use of the hard sciences, the natural sciences, to understand the world around me. And that's enough. And so we come to some even place of mystery, this deeper mystery that we might even call God. And I think that's an important thing for us to be okay with. But how do we help people to engage that beyond just that and engage with a dialogue with Scripture and reason and tradition? I think that's an important thing for us to think about. If you haven't read philosophy much, I think that it's one of the things that we as Christians especially as Protestant Christians, have not paid close enough attention to. I think that we don't think about how we actually formulate our arguments, how we actually formulate our understandings of God and of ourselves and of the world. And I don't think that we've done a very good job of creating good, reasoned, rational understandings all the time and apologetics of why we believe what we believe. And we've left that open then to this kind of cult of personality and to religious experience alone being our guide. And so I think being able to use philosophy and the arguments for and against the things that we believe and being able to use logical, rational thought is an important thing. There's some great resources out there that you might think about looking at. There's one, Philosophy for Kids, and Philosophy in the Classroom are two books that are really great in terms of just giving you some tools to think about how can I use philosophical things, logic games, and other things to help inform and deepen, perhaps, the discussions that you want to have with your young people. Most of the time, we don't think of critical thinking as part of our job as youth and family ministers. But I will say that I think that it's one of our critical jobs in the church, is that critical thinking is not necessarily being taught in other places. So I commend you to think about how are you teaching thinking in and of itself, logic. How am I informing how the young people and their families understand and develop their thinking? It's an important thing for us to look at as well. Well, I think that's all I have for this week. For your writing for this week, I'm going to invite you to please each of you write a short synopsis of what you have used to this point in terms of developing your own thinking, your own Christian thinking, your own thoughts about religion. What are the sources you've primarily used, and what sources you may want to practice with later. Everyone please post this week by Wednesday and respond to somebody else's post sometime by Thursday, okay? And I look forward to reading those and looking at them. And again, my apologies for last week. I'll be updating. You'll see a new post for an updated reading list schedule, and we'll move on from here. Thank you. You're all in my thoughts and prayers, and good luck this week. Bye-bye.